Hey everybody, it's the holiday season and I'm back in my original stomping grounds. The grounds themselves of which are pretty muddy. I was hoping to see more snow than I ended up to see so far this visit. There's a little bit longer, but the nice thing is it's been really mild outside. I am almost overdressed right now. So while I watch my step, I'm going to share just a few things about the aftermath of being lukewarm. First of all, as I like to do occasionally, I want to review what this channel's content, what this series content is about. So Where Was I is a video series in which I'm actively, sometimes in real time on camera, working through my own faith deconstruction journey. This is the pond that I grew up with. Random trivia about Jeremy Loomis. I grew up in New York with a pond that iced over every winter. And I didn't learn how to ice skate until after I moved to Florida. In fact, I didn't understand how anybody could ice skate. It seems so strange to balance on one thin blade for each leg. I quite enjoy it now. I don't do it often, but I don't do much of the things I enjoy often enough. That speaks to a bigger problem that I think affects a lot of society and not just myself. But that's not really what we're here to talk about. So Where Was I is a faith deconstruction journey, sometimes playing out in real time. I don't like scripting things. I think the best way of finding words for an experience is by having your mind actually be in that space while you're trying to do so. And so just to check in for those who may only be joining now, first of all, these things do build. I wouldn't, if you're right at the beginning of a faith deconstruction journey, I wouldn't recommend starting 12 episodes in, because not only am I laying context in the early episodes, but the developments that take place over the course of time could feel like a bit much to just suddenly leap to. For instance, it wasn't until the last couple episodes that I released that I started talking about the resentment, which is actually a big part of why I wanted to do this, because I was so tired of living with just this anger always under my skin. And talking about it and reaffirming that I'm not the only one who has gone through a process like this. Let me say what that even means. A process like this, i.e., feeling displaced from the life you grew up in, the church culture, which really is a culture, that I was raised in. You know, I grew up in a rural, very small church community, went off to a Christian college that was even more conservative than my upbringing was. And so this pretty much was my life for 30 some years. And when you go through that, only to come out of it wondering if any of it had been based on anything real, or if it was true, or if there were just happy stories that we were telling ourselves to structure our life around, that's it is a lot to get through. It's a lot once the honest authentic questions in your heart are ones you think you could be thrown out of the room for asking. Or like, if you voiced what you really thought, you could be looked at as an alien by even your own family. I am not equating the two, but I think it's the closest I'll ever know to what it's like to feel afraid to come out to your own family. Because it's like knowing that it's not safe to show yourself. And then just kind of having to decide, am I going to always keep this part of myself hidden? Am I always going to have the anxiety of knowing that you even have to give energy to deciding, is it safe? Is it safe to show up as all of who I am? I don't know if I can get through here. This looks like a bit much. So I grew up in that, and I think I'd actually have a bit of difficulty putting into words how I went from being a Baptist kid who learned a bunch of the Bible to a conservative Christian college student who completed a Bible minor to later on in more charismatic church being a third year school of ministry student who was pretty much learning how to help run the media side of a church, to finding myself with questions resurfacing and me not being able to press them down anymore. Questions that somehow, after 30 plus years in the system, I know it sounds pejorative to say the system. It's just some of the stuff in hindsight, it's hard not to look at it as a cult, especially the Baptist years. But it is a system in terms of it being a religion, a religious structure. And so, a self-maintaining system, I would say. And so, it was strange for me to have all that, and you would think with all that time would come a lot of experience. But after 30 some years, the questions that just were never really laid to rest for me came back up again. And I realized that week after week I was in these worship services where people all around me seemed to be touched in a real way. Because look, this is a side note, but like, it never sat right with me when people would call it all emotionalism, like worship music and stuff, and say, well, they do it that way to make you feel a certain way. I was like, well, yeah, that you feel any kind of way because your heart is open to something. It's create an emotional atmosphere, because sometimes, a lot of times, especially if you've been through any kind of trauma, we close off parts of ourselves. And if there's any way to get back into those places, if there was a loving God and you wanted a relationship with that God, then what if music was the only way to open your own heart enough to have that kind of intimate moment? Just like how King Saul was completely out of control and David would come to play music for him. He was, from what it sounds like in the text, he was in straight up psychotic, manic episodes, and music would actually help him to stabilize, at least for a bit. So, it's like, what the hell is the point of calling it emotionalism? Do you look a little further down the line and see, well, what's working and what's not? Are you just trying to steer clear of anything that could be misconstrued as something else? Or are you looking at the fruit and the potential fruit of something that could actually pay rewards? It's like, just keep showing up and don't pretend your heart's not part of the equation. So, I'm going to go that way. I'm going to try to go that way. Where was I? So to go through all of that over so many years, only to come out of it thinking, oh, I think I've become agnostic. It's quite a surprise to me. It wasn't me, it's part of me that thinks it's ridiculous to even need to explain this. Maybe I don't need to explain this. But I will. Just to say, I wasn't out looking to debunk Christianity. I wasn't out to sow seeds of doubt. I came by this honestly because year after year after year and week after week of worship services, I just carried on with this lack of clarity and lack of relationship with God. To where when people say, His presence is so strong in this place, can you feel it? I'd hear people say stuff like that for year after year. And even now at the age of 38, I still don't know what they're talking about. I don't know what they mean. And that leads me into the point that I sort of led with, saying that I wanted to talk about being lukewarm. I think I said the aftermath of being lukewarm. So, I think I recently mentioned the 7 churches in Asia Minor, which were listed in the first few chapters of Revelation. John wrote these letters to these 7 churches. And when he wrote to Laodicea, which I believe was the final of those churches, there was a note sent forward to them as a reprimand, saying that, a note on Jesus' behalf, saying, you're neither hot or cold, and because you're lukewarm, I'll spit you out of my mouth. This is a familiar passage if you were a church kid. However, I bet you heard it explained wrong. So did you know hot and cold are both good things? I can't even, in hindsight, this is so bizarre, but you kind of just swallow whatever you're given when you grow up in church. And unfortunately, a lot of times tradition just plain gets passed down without being questioned or really consciously thought much about. So you end up reading a verse about being lukewarm and hearing it explained as, well, Jesus would rather you be hot and on fire for him or cold and want nothing to do with him than to be just kind of in the middle in this tepid space and this middle ground where you kind of no good for anything. It doesn't actually make any sense. And so if you actually know historical context to this, you know that the Laodiceans, they had some context for what the therapeutic benefits of hot and cold were, due to hot springs they had access to that were soothing. Just like if you're nursing an injury, you might put a heating pad on it or go to a hot spring. It's not like I need an analogy for what it literally is. Or, same thing, cold, refreshing water. It's like a thing can exist in different states of being beneficial, but a thing can also live in a state of inactivity. A state of inactivity, and there's a word for this. A state of being not just inactive, but ineffectual. So you may remember, if you've been watching all of these, you may remember from early on, even if you could sense some real frustration in me, you could also see that it mattered to me to at least attempt to deal with this subject matter in an even-handed way. I don't want to be just another deconstructionist who is running a smear campaign against the church. I am interested in people being okay after going through something that they experienced it as a deep violation. And if not a deep violation, likely at minimum a deep disturbance in their personal sense of security and stability as they find themselves having to question what they took to be sure about reality and their place in it. So I bring that up to say that as these episodes have gone on, if you've been paying close attention, I think you'll recognize that I haven't so much been here to say, I'm finally free, you guys. The church was a lie. God was false completely. And the sooner we can reckon with that, the happier we'll be. That hasn't been my MO at all. And I invite you now to start over from the beginning if you think that has been what I'm out to accomplish. Because here's one thing that's been really grueling in this process for me, or for somebody like me. There's, in the psychological community, there's a term called ambiguous loss. This is different from when your loved one dies. This can be like, let's say you have a spouse who's in the military and they don't come back, but there's also no evidence that they were killed. So you have to go on and live your life with the understanding that your loved one may be dead and may not be. Ambiguous loss can also look like someone still being there physically, but no longer being there mentally. So let's say that your grandmother is your favorite person in the world, but she's got dementia or she's got Alzheimer's, and she's not the same person you always knew her to be. She's still there with you, and at the same time, she's already gone. So ambiguous loss is like this soul-torturing type of loss where you're not afforded the closure of it being over for sure. So as I pass through these woods, as I pass through this series of episodes and, just try to navigate and try to explain what my experience has even been, because some of you are going to get it as soon as you hear it. You're going to know what I'm talking about. And some of you are going to be like, why is Jared being such a dick about this? He's just got so much to be thankful for. He had a family that loved him in a church that was probably better than he's describing it as. I believe ambiguous loss applies in a situation like this too. Especially if you're like me, and you can't really let go of the idea that all of this was designed, that love is what powers the universe, and that there probably is a God, even though I don't know if that God has a face, because we anthropomorphize everything. Why would we have so many Disney movies with animals that are shaped like human beings. I think we do the same thing with God. And I don't know if there is a God. I don't know that God is anything like us, other than it does seem to me everything's derivative, right? It does seem to me that if there's a God, then we do seem to have been made in God's image. Whatever that means. Because there are some quite clear differences that set humanity apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. But what a thing to try to pass through. What a lot of mess to try to work through. When you're brought up in Sunday school and junior church to sing all these songs, the Bible, yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the Word of God, the Bible, Bible, and like all these things. I'm not even trying to criticize. What a thing to say. I'm not even trying to criticize indoctrination, because again, a church culture is a culture. If I'd grown up Muslim, I would have been taught Islam. Of course I would have. Why would I not? A child is not. A child must be taught. And why would you not impart your way of life to your own flesh and blood? But the indoctrination is a lot to try to grapple with and make any kind of sense of. Once it no longer makes sense, once the bottom falls out of it, or once you are trying to lean on this God only to have this enduring sense that when you show up to meet with God, no one's showing up to meet with you, and you're just kind of in the darkness of your mind alone. I've never much cared for being alone. This has been pretty wandering already. This episode has been about as wandering as my walk has been. But when I talk about ambiguous loss in the context of faith deconstruction, I am talking about this enduring sense that there is something more, and that there may even be a way to find it and connect with it, and that I don't know how it is that all the time and energy and even some training that I've been given in my time in the church fell short of enabling me to make that connection. So the ambiguous loss is that I'm not what it would just be reductive, as I've said before, to straight up call myself an agnostic, because I would say that would surely carry the connotation that says, I don't think that, it's like maybe, but why would I just take it completely on faith? I don't expect there's a way to know. See, that's the thing. It's like, I don't think I've made the connection. But there's a part of me, this frustrating, stubborn, enduring part of me, that still suspects there is something behind the curtain. And that this can be known. But I was realizing how long I've been recording, and it's like, I sort of set this up like the point of it was the lukewarm thing. I think this does all tie together. You're just not going to be hearing, 20 or 30 minutes of talk about being lukewarm. Here's the point I'm trying to drive home. It's not all technique. Please leave a comment below if you resonate with what I'm about to say. If my boots schlepping through the mud doesn't get in the way of hearing what I'm about to say. Traditionally, when we've been taught about being lukewarm, it's directed us to a specifically inward focus. So we are asking ourselves, generally when people are teaching from this passage, it's inviting us to examine our own hearts individually, to say, am I really sold out for God? Am I really sold out for Jesus? And then the place we're invited to go, and the place we often stay, is this stance of am I lukewarm? And what do I need to repent for to change this? And do I just need to try harder? So let's zoom out a bit. Because what I want to talk about here, and I won't belabor this point, but this is the main point. I want to talk about an entire system being lukewarm, which actually is what the passage was talking about, because it wasn't directed to one person, it was directed to the church of Laodicea. And let me also push back against something else that I was taught, which was the church age theory of the 7 churches in Revelation. That you could make a case for it, just as you could make a case for a lot of things. But when you do the church age theory, which is to say that the 7 churches were listed out in sequence of different ages of the church throughout the centuries since Jesus walked the earth, and that it laid it out in sequence of what most typified the universal church. Although I've often suspected that the way that they make that theory fit is by only looking at the Western church, but I'll digress from that. In that model and in that theory, the idea is to accept that Laodicea was representative of the final church age before the second coming of Christ, and that the lukewarm church pictures today's church at large. Here's where I don't buy that, and here's where I think it's actually a destructive way of looking at it. There comes a point where you will believe that you are who people say you are, which can, and I believe does, lead to a lot of church people just kind of mournfully self-flagellating, being more interested in seeing themselves as filthy sinners rather than seeing themselves as a new creation. Because if you believe in both of those things, at some point you have to reckon with the fact that those are not things that coexist at the same time. That's a thing that you transition from the one thing to the other. You can't be much good to anybody else if you persist and insist on yourself being a worthless piece of human garbage. That's been really toxic in a lot of the conservative church, to think it's somehow humble to hate yourself. If someone loves you and you're receiving that love, part of that means making room to receive what they believe about you and what they say about you. And that's what becoming a new creation is about. Having your perspective realigned, so something in you can grow again. I did not think this was exactly where I would be on my parents' property at the point of making this part of the video. This is a field that I cut down. My dad can be pretty busy with a lot of things. And this whole field used to be a terrible tangle of honeysuckle and vines. It was a pretty cathartic experience to cut it all down with a machete one summer. And also an eye-opening experience to just see how complex the root system of vines can become. I don't know how long it would take the land to heal after having all that cut up in it, because I'm sure there's plenty of fragments of vines throughout. But this is a patch of land that has a chance again to support life that is placed there intentionally instead of just being overrun. Selah. And so, to be loved and to move from almost a developmental stage of black and white thinking and of shame for just being a person, moving into a paradigm, a reality that says, guess what? It's good to be human. And here's what we can do. Here's what we can be empowered to do. Here is the real world change that we can make because we have the love, the power, and the sound mind to do so. That doesn't coexist with a life of shame. A lifestyle of shame, I believe, is what made a lot of my church experience feel almost utterly powerless. And that's why I'm so concerned in everything I make to find where to draw the line. What do we mean when we say whatever it is we're saying? Have we left any stone unturned? Is it possible that we were sold a bill of goods about who God was, and that the truth of the matter is that we just got a cardboard cutout of what somebody thought God was, and that we were told to have a relationship with that, and that many of us were walked headlong into existential frustration and perpetual repentance that led to no freedom from our vices because we're still medicating ourselves for feeling so lonely on such a deep existential level. Could it be that whatever the answer is, many of us never latched onto it or formed a secure attachment with it because the ones who taught us didn't have that secure attachment either, nor access to it? This is the problem as I see it. When you've been hurt in this way, whether it's spiritual abuse or neglect, you end up in the same situation as a lot of the Western church did in recent generations, where because they were taught the doctrine of the rapture, they assumed that it's always been that way, even though that was a doctrine that was devised in recent history. When you're brought up in something, you assume you've been handed down this ancient tradition that's always been true, and so it's worth always holding on to and never questioning. The problem is, when it doesn't make any fucking change in your life, you have to start to question it, because we're talking about the power of the universe. And if that is not incredibly potent, then you've missed it. I think I have more to say, but I'm also about to go hang out with my parents. So I think I'm going to pick this up another time. I know that it's been painful and confusing. I know the details have varied enough that your experience is probably substantially different from mine, and I hope there's some comfort in whatever we have in common. So take a break whenever you need to take a break, but stay curious, because there's more to find, and I'm sure of it, and I don't know what it is. But I'm not willing to become a nihilist. Because it matters that we are here, and it's going to matter that we were here. And it isn't all for nothing. So stay curious, my friends.